Excellent. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us today on this Waymark and Mishcon de Reya roundtable discussion on data privacy and cybersecurity. Just a quick introduction to myself. My name is Mark Holmes. I'm the CEO and founder of Waymark Tech, a UK-based regulatory technology company. And what we wanted to do today was just have an open fireside chat, if you will, regarding data privacy and cybersecurity. From our last webinar, which we did last month on hybrid working models, the outcome is that home working is here to stay. But that poses several challenges for business. Since the first lockdown, government data has shown that more than 1/3 of UK businesses have reported cybersecurity breaches. And what's more, a recent report from cloud service provider called CMW revealed a 900% increase in ransomware attacks compared to the first half of 2020. And the recent Colonial Pipeline incident back in May really illustrates how a successful ransomware attack can be successful. Painted on the background of ongoing Brexit, GDPR turning 3 years old, there is a lot to unpack in this particular space that is going to have huge consequences and impact on businesses going forward. So with that in mind, we wanted to introduce our friends from Mishcon de Reya. So joining me today, I have John Baines, who is the Senior Data Protection Specialist in the Innovation Department at MDR. He has more than 15 years experience and he advises clients across the whole of the firm's practice areas on data protection issues. Along with John, I have Joe Hancock. Joe is partner and head of the MDR Cyber, the cyber practice at Mishcon de Reya, and he focuses on providing strategic cyber advice. So as we go through the session today, please do put any questions that you might have into the attendee chat box. We will then get to answering those as we go through the session. So what I want to do now is just open up the web room, introducing Joe and John. What I'd like to do is if both of you could just give a quick 1-minute introduction, overview of your work focus areas, and maybe if I can ask you also to answer this question. So what is the one thing you wish everyone knew about your particular topic area? So John, if I start with you, if you can give a quick intro, and actually no, let's start with you, Joe. Sorry. So Joe, if you can give a quick overview, and the one thing you wish everyone knew about cybersecurity.
Absolutely, yeah. So thank you very much for having me along to chat. Great to be here. I'm Joe Hancock. I'm a partner at Mishcon de Reya. I'm not a lawyer. I run the cybersecurity practice. So my background is as a cybersecurity practitioner. I started out when this was called information security, and no one had heard of it. And now it's cybersecurity that everyone has, but that doesn't necessarily mean that anything's necessarily improved. So the one thing that I wish everyone kind of knew is that cybersecurity is something that everyone needs to kind of be part of. It's not this thing just for cybersecurity people. It's not for IT. It's not for techies. Just doing the basics across any business organization or even our personal lives makes you like infinitely more safe. So yeah, that's my single top factor.
Fantastic. Thanks for that. And I think over the last few years, everyone sort of had to become in some way a bit of a data protection or cybersecurity expert. So yeah, it'd be good to get more on that. I noticed that a little bit of a technical issue. We don't have John's picture up here. John, can you hear me though? Okay, apologies. We seem to have a little bit of a technical connection issue with John. So while the guys in the back room fix all of that, I guess Joe, you and I can soldier on.
Sure.
So with Christmas coming around the corner, I'm kind of inspired to to put this chat in a bit like a Christmas carol, ghost of past, present, and future, if you will. So, starting with sort of looking into the recent past, in the last few years, within the cybersecurity space, what do you consider to have been the main sort of themes and challenges?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's well, the main theme that has shaped everything for the past 2 years, obviously, there's been the global pandemic, and cyber's been no different there. You know, when the pandemic first started, I think we all had a kind of sky falling in moment. We were all going to work from home forever, and that was going to lead to inordinate cyber risk, and everyone's going to be so much more vulnerable in their homes. And actually, that hasn't really come to pass in my experience. Some things have got a little bit more difficult. It is harder to get hold of someone's IT equipment if they're at home and they're not in the office. You don't have the person at the desk next door to you to turn to and say, hey, you know, should I click on this link? Is this email legitimate? But actually, the sky hasn't fallen. What we did see there was kind of attackers really really lent into the kind of the pandemic. So as soon as the US announced stimulus checks, we would see within 24 hours attackers sending everyone emails saying, hey, click here to get your stimulus check. You know, lots of attackers pretending to be the PHE in the UK, these kind of things. But that's, if anything, I think the pandemic kind of made it a bit easier for attackers, because all they had to do was send people emails with COVID in there, as opposed to having to try and pretend to be their bank and their employer and those kind of things. But against that kind of background, the real big issue effective has been ransomware. That's been the major problem. And this has come around for kind of two reasons. The first is that actually you still don't have to be a very sophisticated attacker to gain access to a relatively commercially successful organization. I mean, by that, I don't necessarily mean in terms of size and scale, but just someone who has the kind of money and therefore propensity to kind of pay a ransom. And also, secondly, that we've seen ransomware actors to a certain degree move very quickly to kind of take on the latest attacks and those kind of things. And so ransomware, we saw it be really big in 2018, dropped off in 2019, really big in 2020, and that is still very much the big problem at the moment. And what we're seeing is organizations get hit, how it affects you is really then defined by how you respond to it. And a lot of people don't respond very well because it's very difficult to respond when you can't access everything. But now we see attackers move towards taking data outside of organizations rather than just encrypting everything and stopping them using their technology, like exfiltrating the data and then threatening to publish it as another way of kind of holding someone to ransom. And that's very successful. If you're sat on a load of trade secrets, or you hold sensitive client data, say for example you're a law firm, you don't want that in the public domain, so it works kind of very well. So I think if we look back from today, definitely to me it's the kind of the rise of cybercrime, in some ways facilitated by the pandemic, but I think where we are today is definitely shaped by that.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, and just on that thing you talked about there about sort of responding to those ransomware attacks, and obviously getting a bit more sophisticated, the exfil of data. Can you share with us some of the memorable, I guess, successes and more importantly, I guess, failures you've seen where people haven't actually managed to respond to that in the right way, and what are the lessons we can learn from that? I guess both from the organizations and also how have the regulators moved as well to respond to this increased threat?
Yeah, definitely. So if dealing with ransomware is an area that effectively, I always say, generates stories, because you're negotiating sometimes with cyber criminals who and all the kind of the interesting personality that comes with that. Slightly, we find our most successful kind of whether a client decides to pay a ransom or not, our most successful kind of scenarios there come from where we're dealing with an organized criminal opponent, because they're organized, they know the rules of the game, they're very easy to deal with. But the ones we struggle to deal with more are actually kind of people what I call the amateurs, people that are having a bit of a go at extortion because they're very emotional, they don't really kind of know what they're doing. And actually it's this really strange world where you get to a point where it is actually quite positive to be dealing with organised crime. Don't get me wrong, I wish organised crime didn't exist, but at the same time, it is, it is easier. We've had some success in those areas. Things that kind of don't go so well. I'm often in the position where I kind of, clients, when it's an incident response situation, clients speak to me when they're having the worst day of their year, right? Which is, it's never a great place to be. I wish I could speak to them much more often in nicer terms. But often I'm also then delivering kind of bad news. And one of the areas of bad news, especially that we deliver a lot, is that, be it a ransomware attack or a business email compromise, which we see a lot of, is someone accessing a corporate email account, it's that data protection side of things. So I work very often with John, the fact that, we will see a great response to the cyber attack. We'll get involved, we'll help, we'll get everything remediated, get people back on their feet. But then there is often a difficulty around them recognizing that, okay, now someone's had access to that inbox. We now need to go through there, work out what items of personal data are included, and then we need to go into the process off the side of this of, okay, now do we need to notify a regulator, be it the information commissioner or regulated by somebody else? And that's one area, it's an area I'm sure John will speak to, is that we often see that being the kind of the weak point still, where either because people over notify, and again, I know this is definitely something that John can talk to, notify when they perhaps don't have to, but also treat cyber attacks just as cyber problems and don't think about the wider data protection or business ramifications. So, everything from proactive PR. I've seen great proactive PR externally, but then where people, organizations have forgotten to communicate with their staff. Everyone knows there's a security incident happening, but no one ever kind of tells them. I was once in a lift on client site where a big ransomware attack. We've been there for weeks, and a member of the staff was just having the same lift group. He said, "Oh, are you here to help with our IT issue?" I thought that the IT issue was a complete secret and no one knew what was happening. I said, "Oh, how do you know?" So, well, the only person within 3 miles of here wearing a suit. Because it was a big luxury kind of fashion client. And so it was, everyone across the organization knew what was going on, but we tried to keep a lid on it and hadn't kind of communicated internally, but we got a great PR plan externally. And so that's the one thing I definitely kind of think people could do better, is kind of having this all-encompassing plan, which includes, regulatory notification, PR, comms, internally and externally, how you're going to deal with legal, how you're going to deal with the technical side of things, because this is it is a team sport in the kind of widest sense of the world.
Excellent. I see that we still don't have John's camera, but do we have John online? Still a few problems there with tech connectivity. So I guess just picking up on something you said there, obviously having this team sport and having that combined approach, and you mentioned that you have quite a lot of crossover with John. So from that, I take it that you see, there is common ground between cyber and data protection, and that they're not sort of different landscapes.
Yeah, completely. They're different sides of the same coin to a certain degree. We'll often see the data protection world set the requirements for security. And then security issues can have data protection consequences. They're absolutely linked. A breach of confidentiality will lead to a potential personal data issue. Or maybe another way of looking at it is there a Venn diagram with a large overlap in the middle. They're not entirely kind of a data privacy impact assessment will look at risk from a kind of privacy perspective, and I'll look at it from a security perspective, but actually, you're still looking at the same kind of underlying kind of issues. It's all risk. So yeah, I'd say 80 to 90% of the incidents that I deal with will have some level of engagement with John's team and our wider data protection lawyers, because most incidents involve personal data of some kind or another now. Even if let's call it a simple financial fraud, where an email inbox gets compromised, someone changes some bank details, payment goes to the wrong place. You still need to consider whether or not you need to report that to the regulator. It will probably in that case would be a very short consideration, and you would decide not to, because there's probably no risk to the individuals involved. But again, as I said, if you find out that the person whose email was compromised is also, there may be an HR, and in their inbox there's a big spreadsheet of all employees' names, home addresses, salary details, those kind of things. You now start to see a simple security problem, it's a simple fraud, actually become a big data protection issue, or kind of not. So we tend to find these things are very kind of connected. We always have to consider one angle or the other.
Okay, very interesting. Thanks for that, Joe. So again, until we can hear John, I guess what we'll do is we'll move on from sort of the recent past, and we've touched upon a few of them there. But thinking about the present, with the worst of the pandemic hopefully now behind us, you mentioned obviously ransomware was hot and it probably still is. But what would you think, or what do you think are the hottest sort of topics right now?
Yeah, I mean, I said cybercrime is very much here to stay. We still see, ransomware being, I think, the attack du jour. The other two main areas of issue we see are things affecting the supply chain. So, you can be really secure as an organisation, but if the people who supply things to you aren't, that kind of undermines your security, and also can undermine your data protection compliance, because especially if those people are processing data on your behalf, or they hold customer details, or you don't have the right contractual protections in place. So not just kind of practicing what you preach, but also having your suppliers practice what they preach as well. And if they have issues, making sure they tell you about them, because their issue can become your problem. And then the other major area we're seeing develop now is this kind of nexus between what I would have historically called financial crime and cybercrime. And all financial crimes to a certain degree are becoming cybercrimes. Whether that's even if it's an insider problem, say you have an expenses fraud, most people do their expenses electronically now. There's an electronic angle to it, and you need digital evidence in a way that you even go back kind of 15 years ago, people were still posting expenses in internal mail systems and all those kind of things. The evidence is kind of there, it's physical. But now everything we deal with is digital, even if it's digital financial crime or kind of true cybercrime. And we're seeing lots of organisations that struggle from a kind of I wouldn't say from a regulatory perspective, but from a senior management perspective, because the chief information security officer or the head of IT or the person who's historically dealt with cyber or data problems is now being asked to deal with this financial crime problem, because who else does it kind of sit with? And I also see a bit of in some organisations around the data protection side of things. Someone in IT security or IT is going to say, okay, well, this is all data. Can you handle this data protection problem? So there's definitely some kind of there's definitely change coming there, where more and more people are aware of the problems, but it's not necessarily someone's defined role to fix it.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Joe. I think we've had the problem is solved, and John is now with us.
Hi, Mark. Can you hear me?
I can indeed. Welcome to the conversation. Apologies for the technical problems you've had.
I'm so interested in privacy, Mark, that I refuse to let you see anything but my picture from about 3 years ago, before I had my lockdown haircut. So.
Excellent. So I guess what we'll do is we'll bring you back into the conversation, and where we are at the moment, we're sort of talking around thinking about sort of the present and the issues there. And I think I guess I'm going to ask you to do two things. One, first of all, what do you consider to be the main themes and challenges, like I asked Joe? And then sort of, what's hot in the data protection area at the moment? Obviously, with the landmark ruling that was handed down by the Supreme Court yesterday, affecting data controllers, maybe you could sort of talk a little bit about that and what that might mean.
Yeah, of course. And just very quickly to say sort of who I am, where I am. I'm not a lawyer. I think Joe probably will have introduced himself similarly. So we both work for a law firm, yet we're not lawyers, but we do fee earning work on behalf of clients alongside the lawyers in the firm. My area is data protection and information law in general, I guess. And I come from a practitioner background, so I tend to say that I can sort of talk the talk as well as walk the walk, or the other way around. I'm never quite sure which way it works. But yeah, I mean, thanks for flagging up that case yesterday. It was on one view a bit of a boring court judgment on a real technical issue about how you can bring representative actions under 19.6 of the civil procedure rules, which all sounds dry and dusty and not really very interesting to anyone except lawyers. It's not really the case, though. It's actually a profoundly important matter, which I think affects pretty much all companies. And the reason I say that is what happened was that the court decided not to allow the load of claims against Google to go forward. Now, we all have different views on Google and big tech. Most of us accept them. Most of us use them. But the claims here were on behalf of many million people, and with potential values of billions of pounds for minor data protection infringements. And the court didn't allow these claims to go ahead. The reason it's important is that if it had allowed them to go ahead, then all of us were potentially on the hook for relatively minor data breaches and data infringements. It's not to say that risk has gone away, and it's not to say we can all forget about data protection and cyber compliance, because we certainly can't. But it's really important. It's important when it comes to things like just valuing companies and valuing data that we've got. And it's important to consider when it comes to just how we all approach the issue of risk and risk in a data context. That's very much one of the sort of hot topics that's going on at the moment, Mark.
Excellent. Thanks for that insight, John. So sort of taking that thought forward, then, you're saying this is a hot area. So, how do you think that companies in general are they in general as mature as they need to be in this area?
Look, we provide advice to such a range of companies, and Joe may have a different view here. I'd say in the round, you come across some clients who really aren't doing anything near to what they should be doing, and they're operating under quite a high level of information risk, and that means legal risk and regulatory risk. And we'll come across some who are doing beyond what they need to do. They're kind of bulletproof. The vast majority, though, I think the landscape is pretty reasonable. But there's always grounds for improvement. Going back to my observations on that case, just because Google won and just because these huge mass claims didn't go forward, it doesn't mean that there aren't consequences for getting things wrong. There's still very much the risk of regulatory enforcement action, still very much the risk of lower number legal claims. So I think the picture's, I wouldn't profess that my practice area is one where I cast my eye across the landscape and think you're all a load of idiots and you're doing everything wrong, because that's not the case. I think generally people are doing pretty much the right thing, and the right thing when it comes to a proportionate approach, when it comes to a risk analysis.
Excellent, thank you. And Joe, I guess same sort of question for you. You were highlighting obviously ransomware, supply chain, this merging of fin crime to cyber crime. Again, similarly, how do we feel that companies have a handle on this and are as mature as they need to be?
I think that I always like to think that every year this is the year when cybercrime will be solved, and I kind of won't have a job anymore, and I can, I'll do security audits and everything will be great. And every year I'm disappointed. I think that there's definitely been improvement. I think that improvement has been in larger organisations or organisations which are regulated, and where effectively either customer pressure, good governance, or regulation has kind of forced the issue. I think I think small businesses, bizarrely now, are actually better served because the government has a whole load of programs around security in the SME space. The issues I see are kind of mid-tier organisations, where big enough to have big company problems, but small enough not to have the dedicated resource, be it people, money, technical capability, whatever it is, to deal with them. And that's where I kind of see the issue at the moment. I don't think COVID's helped here, because you'd think that cybersecurity would be one of these kind of issues that you do regardless. I remember from the kind of 2007, 2008, 2009 financial crisis that when you're put under financial pressure, you make risk-based decisions. If you say, okay, I can spend this money on retaining these free staff, or I can put some technology in place or something that will prevent a cyber attack. And actually, you know what? This year I'm prepared to take the chance on that because we're in really tough economic times, and you know what? I've got a bigger problem over here. And so actually, you tend to see that compliance and security budgets are normally the same thing. And if compliance goes up, security goes down. Or if the budget gets shrunk, you still have to comply, so security kind of goes down. So I think for some organisations, COVID won't have been great from an overall security perspective, but I suspect those are probably in that kind of middle tier, so big enough to have the problem, small enough not to yet be able to deal with them. And I know we're going to kind of come on to it, but when we look forward to the future, you can see a kind of, maybe there's regulation, maybe something over the hill that might change that kind of calculation. But for now, that's where I see things.
Excellent. Thanks for that. So obviously, these challenges we were talking about are company-wide challenges. It's not just a department that affects all different departments, but within our audience is predominantly risk and compliance. So in respect of that audience, what do you think sort of these professionals should be doing in the final quarter of 2021, heading into 2022? Where should their focus be? What can they do right now in order to prepare for next year?
So, I mean, I think from my perspective that, I always kind of say that the thing everyone needs to be doing, and kind of not all of the time, and not just this record, is to try and kind of get the basics right. We can all put in place the most advanced security program, all these kind of things, or the most advanced compliance program, but actually it's the basics that tend to cause the problems. So if I had to pick two things out of what the kind of basics are, and the basics are, work out what your problems are going to be, work out what to do about them, do it, and make sure you can respond if it doesn't work right. That really is the kind of the basics. And again, that applies to so many things, not just kind of cybersecurity. The two things I would focus on are ensuring that you have visibility of what's happening in your organization, so you can detect bad things when they occur quickly. And that bad things can include a fraud as much as it can include a cyber attack, and then also make sure that you are able to respond to those as quickly and as effectively as possible. Because the focus now is not really on the fact you had an incident or an issue. They happen to everybody, and we've kind of come to accept that now. It's actually what you do about it. And so that's really where you kind of live and die as a business, and also what the regulator is going to be interested in. Don't get me wrong, there's going to be questions around why you had the problem in the first place, but there'll also be questions into what steps you took to protect customers, to protect the wider economy, doing the right thing. So yeah, to me, that kind of, how you best detect things and how you best respond to them, that to me is the absolute focus at the moment. And most contemporary security strategies kind of heading that way. But again, it all comes down to just making sure you have the basics in place. It doesn't need to be expensive, high tech. You don't need AI, machine learning, all the kind of stuff. It's good policies, resource applied to things. Those kind of things are really good.
Excellent. And John, similar question to you with respect to sort of the risk and compliance professional. Similar question. What do you think should be their core focus coming into the end of this year in preparation for next year?
Yeah, unsurprisingly, it's not a million miles away from what Joe's saying. Well, I guess there are two things. One is make sure that you're aware that, and I'm talking just about my practice area, but make sure that you're aware that post-Brexit we have a data protection regime. It's now called the UK GDPR. But be aware that the government is consulting on potential changes to that regime. And that's not happening in a void. This is happening for a reason. And there's a bit of a tension going on here. There's the tension between the UK having to still primarily keep to a European data protection model, because if we diverge too far, then suddenly trade with Europe and indeed trade with the rest of the world is potentially compromised. But the tension is that one of the reasons that Brexit happened really was so that the UK could become more of a seat for innovation, and perhaps more of a let's just call it a risky jurisdiction. And by risky, I just mean more prepared to take extra risk. So that's the background. So keep an eye on that consultation, because that's really going to be an important series of developments, I'd say, over the coming years. But more fundamentally, more immediately, it really is, it's Joe's point about the basics. And by the basics, when I come to data protection, it's almost before you look at the law, look at what data you've got. You probably should have done this exercise back when GDPR came in. You probably actually should have done it 20 years ago, but not all of us have. But consider what data you've got, and that's personal data, but it's information in general. And there's a sound business reason for doing this. You know, the better that a business knows its information, the better it can use it, the better it understands the risks and the liabilities and the assets that go with that information. So literally catalog it. Now, GDPR requires that. GDPR says, Article 30, you have a record of processing activity, which again sounds dry and dusty, but really it's your information asset registers. It's your risk registers when it comes to information. So make sure you're cataloging it. And I give a good reason why that's a good thing to do. I act quite often for buyers and investors in an M&A context. And when I'm doing that, what I ask the target or the sellers is, have you done this? Have you done this exercise of understanding your information? And the answer we get back is normally, what do you mean? Or, yes, of course, but we don't actually hold a central copy that we can give you. And of course, when you start to get, occasionally you get a great answer, here it is. And as a buyer or an investor, that tells you a hell of a lot about the company that you're interested in. But if you don't get that, it also tells you something. And you can then negotiate or secure warranties appropriate. So it's actually a really important piece of information, a really important exercise. So flip it round. If you're in a risk and compliance role, what should you be doing? Well, you need to be protecting your company. And one of the key ways of doing that is just understanding what's going on. And then, of course, you can then look into how you can use your information as an asset as well. So it's really basic, probably even more basic than Joe's call to arms. It's just understand what you've got and why.
Yeah. Okay, excellent. Thanks for that insight, guys. So that was looking into 22. Let's go a bit further. I'm actually going to start with you, John, and a question that's been raised in the audience. So you were talking about GDPR and UK GDPR there. And the question, which is, I guess, a bit more future-looking, is also, do you see at the age of the technical revolution that there needs to be another GDPR-type legislation coming into force?
That's an excellent question. Look, here's something you probably all know, but it's worth remembering. The law is always catching up with technology. GDPR was first proposed, where are we now? 2021. It's first proposed sort of 2014, and it was meant to solve all the problems of the modern internet. You know, the old law didn't deal with data in an internet age. Let's bring in a new law. Of course, by the time it was passed, it was out of date. Really. So I think it's a really good question. So there are new pieces of law coming. And in Europe, there is an AI regulation being proposed. In the UK, there are various bits of legislation. We've got the online safety bill, which looks at how technology companies and platforms are allowing harmful speech to be put online. So does there need to be a new type of legislation coming forward? Ideally, yes, but it will always be playing catch up. And that can sometimes help and foster innovation, but it can have a flip side that in fact the law and the courts and the judges and the regulators don't fully understand the developments. And so they're a little bit caught in the past and they're trying to regulate for what's already gone. And you don't get particularly tech savvy regulation and tech savvy law and judgments coming in. So I think in answer to Joshua, yes, there should be, but be aware it's always a bit of cat and mouse. This.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks, Adam. Joe, sort of building on that question into your space, what are you anticipating in the cyber world? Say, looking beyond next year into say 2025. What are the developments that you're anticipating?
I think there is definitely going to be a longer term piece of cybersecurity regulation that's more broad, I think. And the reason for that, very simply, is I'll use an example. You look at the Internet of Things, as we're all calling it at the moment. I can't quite put my finger on what it is or isn't yet, but the Internet of Everything might be a better way of putting it. When you've got consumable devices that are very cheap that are connected to things, and they're being produced in the millions, you strip cost out of them, and security is viewed as a cost. And so you've got very cheap, cheerful devices being plugged into all sorts of things. They're going to start to a certain degree creating security issues. We've seen some of it already. And the only way that you can, when you're a manufacturer, you're saying, okay, well, if I have to add 1 penny, 1 cent of security to each of these devices, as soon as you multiply it up by the millions, you kind of have a big problem. And so because I don't have to, I therefore won't. It's a sound commercial decision, even perhaps not if the best societal one. And I can see at some point effectively the hand of regulation tipping those scales a little bit. The danger is that, to John's point, that regulation legislation is ill thought out and not well developed, and actually has some either unintended consequences in other areas or doesn't do what it's intended to, and you actually end up with the usual problem I see, which is that people who were complying anyway now have to comply a bit more, and the people who weren't in the first place, caused all the problems, still don't have to, or just don't comply, and then nothing happens to them. So you don't solve the problem, but you do increase the regulatory burden. That said, the surprise that I can kind of see coming around the corner is, and you touched on Colonial Pipeline in your introduction, there will be an ill-advised ransomware attack, and by that I would argue the Irish healthcare system and Colonial Pipeline were ill-advised, because when you take on large governmental interests or you take on bits of critical national infrastructure, there is public outcry. And that drives a political response, and a political response is often knee-jerk and ill-thought through and designed to, appease people politically. And so we saw this at the Biden executive order in the US that I don't really think it is much use to change things, but again, it's created a whole load of compliance for the federal government and national infrastructure. We could see a piece of legislation, I think, in the UK or in Europe that appears almost overnight because there is a bad security thing and something must be done. And that, to me, is a real problem, because say, for example, that the big ransomware issue, right, no more paying ransoms. We don't negotiate with terrorists. You can't pay them anymore, which is fine. But then there will have to be, for example, you'd hope that there'd be, well, is there a financial mechanism put in place so that the first 10% of organisations that then get hit that can't pay because they now can't legally are now going to go out of business? So does government step in? Do they not? And things like that, I think, will just not be thought about. You could see how no more ransoms comes in, and actually there's then a chunk of businesses that have to live with the consequences of no more ransoms, and actually there's with a negative economic impact. And so you can see things like that where it's the second and third order effects of kind of, let's call it emergency regulation and legislation that I kind of see coming. And again, to John's point, eventually the kind of things catch up and you do get to a sensible place. But I worry we have a rocky kind of 5 to 10 years ahead in this space.
Excellent. Well, listen, I've just seen the time. I could chat to you guys for a lot longer, but unfortunately we have run out of time. We do have some more questions. For those who have asked it, I will pose it to the two gentlemen and get them to answer offline, and we'll return those to you. So just all left for me is really to thank John and Joe for joining us today and sharing their thoughts and insights. I hope you as the audience have found it useful and insightful. I'd like to thank you, the audience, for joining us today. The recording of this will be available after this, and we'll send it out to you via email. I also want to announce our next in the series, which will be about regulatory investigations, how to avoid them, and what to do if they do happen to your organization. That will be our December webinar. So I look forward to hopefully having you on that as well. So with that, I want to thank you again, John, and I want to thank you again, Joe, and you, the audience. We will close the session there. Thank you ever so much.
Fantastic. Thank you.